Hello everyone. Welcome to Mr. Midnight True Crime Stories. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Pull your blanket a little closer tonight, because the story we are going to tell you is one of the most quietly devastating true crime cases in American history. It does not begin with a scream. It does not begin with flashing lights or a crowd gathered on a street corner. It begins the way all the most dangerous things begin. Slowly, softly, almost invisibly, in the drawing rooms and parlors of one of Missouri's wealthiest families, where the fires were always warm and the silver was always polished and nobody, not a single soul, saw what was coming until it was far too late. Tonight, we are going to travel back to Kansas City in the year 1909. A city that was still finding itself. A city of wide boulevards and horse-drawn carriages, and the particular kind of ambition that only exists in places that have grown too fast and are not entirely sure what they have become. The Missouri River curled around its edges like an arm thrown over a sleeping child, and the winters came early and stayed long, and on the best days the whole place smelled of wood smoke and opportunity. It was a city in which a man's name still meant something, in which a family's reputation was a kind of currency, passed down through generations the way silver and land and the color of one's eyes were passed down, in which a story, once told in the right parlor, could travel across the whole of society before the week was out. And at the very center of that society, at the beating heart of Kansas City's self-image, sat one man. One extraordinary, eccentric, enormously wealthy man, whose name was etched into the landscape of the city itself. Thomas Hunton Swope. His friends called him Colonel, though the title was more honorific than military, the kind of address that money and age and a certain bearing tend to accumulate in the American South and Midwest, gathering like moss on stone. He was a tall man, a spare man, a man who wore his suits with a kind of unconscious dignity, as though he had been born already dressed. He had the cheekbones of a patriarch and the eyes of someone who had spent a great deal of time looking at land and calculating what it was worth. And he was, by the autumn of 1909, 80 years old and more alive than most men half his age. He had come to Kansas City in 1860, when the city was barely a city at all. He had arrived with money in his pocket and the kind of vision that looks at scrubland and sees something that does not yet exist. While other men were buying established plots, buying property that already had roads running past it and neighbors close enough to borrow sugar from, Thomas Swope was buying the land that nobody else wanted, the land on the outskirts, the land that people called worthless, the land that sat too far from everything to be convenient and too close to everything to be peaceful. He bought it anyway. He held it. He waited. And then Kansas City grew, the way all American cities of that era grew, explosively, hungrily, spreading out across the landscape like a stain that nobody wanted to stop. And suddenly the land that Thomas Swope had bought for almost nothing was worth more than most men would earn in 10 lifetimes. By the time the autumn of 1909 arrived, his fortune was estimated at $3.5 million. In today's money, that figure would stretch into the hundreds of millions. He was one of the wealthiest men in Missouri, possibly in the entire Midwest. And yet he lived quietly. He lived with the particular restraint of men who had made their own money and had never quite forgotten what it felt like to not have it. He had never married. He had no children of his own. What he had instead was a large and complicated family of nieces and nephews who orbited him the way moons orbit a planet, close enough to feel his gravity, far enough to pretend that they were moving freely. There were 7 of them, 7 nieces and nephews who knew, in the way that families always know these things without ever quite saying them out loud, that one day the old man's fortune would need to go somewhere. One day the colonel would die, because even the colonel would one day die, and when he did, that $3.5 million would have to pass into someone's hands. And in a family of 7, with a fortune that large, the question of whose hands mattered enormously. It mattered in ways that people never admitted. It mattered in ways that changed how people smiled across dinner tables and how warmly they reached out to help an aging uncle down the front steps. The will, as it stood in 1909, divided the estate among the nieces and nephews in varying proportions. The largest single portion, a residuary fund of over $1.5 million, had not yet been definitively assigned. There were whispers that the colonel was considering leaving it to charity, that he had grown philosophical in his old age, that the city he had helped to build was becoming more important to him than the family he had never quite managed to form. Those whispers moved through the family like a draft under a door. Cold, persistent, impossible to ignore. And into that draft, in the summer of 1905, stepped a man named Bennett Clark Hyde. He arrived quietly. Or rather, he arrived in the way that quiet men sometimes arrive, not with noise, but with a kind of careful stillness that makes the people around them do all the talking. He was in his 30s. He was handsome in a particular way, the kind of handsome that photographs well, and that makes mothers nervous. He had dark eyes and a physician's hands and a manner that could be described, depending on who was doing the describing, as either deeply professional or carefully rehearsed. He was, by training and by title, a doctor. He had completed his medical education and had worked as a demonstrator of anatomy, which meant that he spent his professional hours with bodies, opening them, examining them, understanding the interior machinery of human life in a way that most people preferred not to think about. He had also served, briefly, as a police surgeon, a role that brought him into contact with violence and death on a near-daily basis. It was a role from which he had been suspended, though the specific reasons for that suspension were never made entirely clear to the people who were later trying to understand what kind of man he was. There was also the matter of the grave robbing scandal. This was the thing that people mentioned in lowered voices. The allegation, and it was only ever an allegation, the charges were eventually dropped, was that Hyde had been involved in the procurement of cadavers through means that were not entirely legal. Medical schools in that era had a near insatiable demand for bodies to teach anatomy, and the supply of legally donated cadavers was never sufficient to meet it. This had created a shadow industry, a quiet commerce in the dead, and the allegation against Hyde placed him at least adjacent to that commerce. He was never convicted. The charges were dropped. But the allegation had a texture to it, a particular weight, that did not disappear simply because the legal case had been set aside. This was the man who fell in love, or appeared to fall in love, with Frances Swope, the colonel's niece. And this was the man who, in 1905, married her in secret. The secrecy itself was telling. Frances was not a young woman given to theatrics or rebellion. She was, by all accounts, a steady and sensible person, a woman who understood her family and her place in it, and who did not, as a general rule, do things that she knew her family would disapprove of without very careful consideration. And yet she had married Bennett Clark Hyde in secret, which meant that she had known with absolute certainty, that her family would not have blessed the union had they been asked. Her mother, whose name was Maggie, was the first to hear, and Maggie's reaction confirmed everything Frances had feared. "He is after the money," Maggie said, or words to that effect. She said it not with anger, because anger would have been too simple, but with the particular cold clarity of a woman who has spent a lifetime watching other people and has grown very good at reading what is underneath the thing they are showing you. She was not wrong to be worried. The marriage, once revealed, was reluctantly accepted, as these things tend to be, and Colonel Swope even went so far as to purchase a home for the young couple, a gesture of generosity that may have been genuine warmth or may have been the kind of pragmatic accommodation that wealthy families make when the alternative is a scandal. But the unease never left. It sat at every dinner table. It stood in every doorway. It watched Hyde the way a storm watches a coastline, quiet for now, but building. And Hyde, for his part, moved into the orbit of the Swope family with a patience that, in retrospect, had the quality of calculation. He became familiar with the family finances. He became familiar with the household rhythms. He learned who was close to whom, and who was estranged from whom, and who stood to gain the most from the will, and who stood to gain the least. He learned these things the way a man learns the layout of a house he intends to stay in for a very long time. Through the years between 1905 and 1909, the household breathed. Children were born. Holidays were observed. The colonel aged. His health, which had always been the particular robust health of a man who has spent his life outdoors and never pampered himself, began to show the ordinary wear of 80 years. He moved a little more slowly. He leaned a little more heavily on his walking stick. In the autumn of 1909, he fell. It was not a catastrophic fall. He was not broken. He was not incapacitated. But he was shaken, in the way that falls shake old men, not so much in their bones as in their sense of themselves, their confidence in the body's reliability. He decided he wanted bed rest. He decided he wanted a nurse. And so Pearl Keller was hired, a capable, observant woman who would later become one of the most important witnesses in a case that nobody yet knew was a case. And Bennett Clark Hyde, the doctor who had married into the Swope family, the doctor whose background carried shadows that had never quite been addressed, the doctor who had the trust of a man worth millions. Hyde began to make himself indispensable. He visited the colonel frequently. He monitored his condition. He offered opinions on treatment. He was, to all appearances, the attentive and conscientious family physician. Nurse Keller observed him. She did not yet have words for what she was observing, but she watched him the way animals watch something that has not yet moved, but that their instincts have already identified. And then, on the first day of October 1909, the first death arrived. Not the colonel's. Not yet. It was a man named Moss Hunton who collapsed first. Moss Hunton was connected to the Swope family through the intricate web of relationships that wealthy Midwestern families accumulated over generations. He was a trusted figure, a man of standing, a man whose role in the family's financial and legal affairs made him someone whose presence or absence would matter enormously to the disposition of the colonel's estate. He was at dinner. He was talking. He was, by all accounts, well. And then he wasn't. He collapsed with the sudden violence of a body that has been operating normally until the very instant it stops. He was brought to bed. Hyde was summoned. And what happened next was the first moment in this story where something that looked like medicine began to look like something else entirely. Hyde bled him. This was a practice that was already, by 1909, falling out of favor with most reputable physicians. The idea that removing blood from a patient helped restore their equilibrium was a relic of an older medical tradition, a tradition that the science of the era was actively moving away from. The family's regular physician, Dr. Twyman, was called and examined Hunton and said, clearly and firmly, that the bleeding should stop. That 1 pint was the maximum. That taking more would endanger the patient's life. Hyde nodded. Hyde agreed. And then, when Dr. Twyman was no longer in the room, Hyde continued bleeding Moss Hunton. Not 1 pint. 2 quarts. Moss Hunton died. His death was attributed to natural causes. There was no immediate reason to think otherwise. Men of his age did sometimes collapse and die. Their hearts gave out. Their bodies simply stopped. It was sad, but it was not unusual, and in a family already preoccupied with the colonel's declining health, the death of Moss Hunton settled into the general atmosphere of grief and worry that had already begun to accumulate in the mansion like fog. But Hyde was not done. Within days of Hunton's death, Hyde privately approached the family with a suggestion. Now that Hunton was gone, Hyde suggested, the role of executor of the colonel's estate, a role of enormous financial significance, a role that would give its holder enormous influence over how $3.5 million was ultimately distributed. That role might reasonably pass to Hyde himself. Nobody agreed immediately. Nobody said yes. But nobody said anything that stopped Hyde from continuing to suggest it. And nobody, in those first days after Hunton's death, connected what they were hearing to what had just happened. That connection would come later. It would come in circumstances so dark and so deliberate and so breathtaking in their cold-blooded patience that even a century later, reading the accounts, it is difficult to believe that a human being planned and executed what was done in the Swope mansion in the autumn and winter of 1909. But the story is not finished. The colonel was still alive. The house was still warm. The fires were still burning. And 2 days after Moss Hunton died, Hyde gave the colonel a tablet. A digestive tablet, he said. Something to help the old man's stomach settle. Something entirely ordinary. Something a careful physician might offer an ailing patient on any evening in any house in any city in America. The colonel took it. And what happened next is the kind of thing that stays with you. The kind of thing that makes you lie very still in the dark and think about trust, and about how we place ourselves in the hands of people we believe mean us well. We will tell you what happened next. But first, take a slow breath. Let your body settle. You are safe where you are, and the story will still be here when you are ready. The tablet was small. That is the detail that stays with you when you think about it long enough. It was small, and it was white, or close to white. and it sat in the palm of Bennett Clark Hyde's hand with the absolute ordinariness of something that could not possibly matter. A digestive tablet. Something for the stomach. The kind of thing a doctor might offer a patient the way a grandmother might offer a peppermint. Casually, warmly, with a smile that said, "This is nothing. This is care. This is what I am here for." The Colonel was 80 years old. He had been resting in his bed for several days following his fall. He was tired in the way that very old men are tired after they have been frightened by their own bodies. Not the tiredness of sleep deprivation or overwork, but the deeper, quieter tiredness of a man who has begun to understand that the machine is winding down and that there is nothing in particular to be done about it. He was cooperative. He was, by all the accounts of those who were present, still himself, still sharp-eyed, still possessed of that dry, particular humor that had endeared him to the city he helped build. He trusted the man standing at his bedside. He trusted him because Bennett Clark Hyde was his niece's husband. He trusted him because Hyde had presented himself, for 4 years, as a competent and attentive physician. He trusted him because he was 80 years old and lying in his bed, and the man offering him the tablet was the doctor in the room. And when you are 80 years old and your body is reminding you of its limitations, you tend to take the medicine the doctor hands you. He took it. Within minutes, not hours, not the slow progression of an ordinary illness working its way through an aged body, but minutes, the Colonel began to convulse. Pearl Keller, the nurse who had been hired weeks earlier and who had been observing the household with the quiet, professional attention of someone trained to notice changes in a patient's condition, was present. She saw it happen. She saw the way the Colonel's body responded to whatever had entered it, the violent, involuntary contractions of muscles that were no longer under any conscious control, the way his face changed, the way his eyes registered something that was not pain exactly, but was the body's most primitive alarm, the signal that something has gone catastrophically wrong at a level below language and below thought. She saw Hyde's face too. That was the thing she would remember. That was the thing she would turn over in her mind in the days and weeks that followed, trying to find an interpretation that made sense, trying to reconcile what she saw with the story she was supposed to believe. Hyde watched the Colonel convulse, and the expression on his face was not the expression of a physician confronted with a medical emergency. It was not alarm. It was not the focused, urgent look of a doctor reaching for the tools of intervention. It was something else. Something she did not have a word for in that moment, but that she would find words for later, when the truth had had time to arrange itself into a shape she could recognize. Hyde did not call another physician. This was the fact that, more than almost any other single fact in the case, would later seem impossible to explain. A man has been given medicine. A man is in violent convulsions. The standard response, the only responsible response, is to call for additional medical support immediately, to summon the family physician, to get more eyes, more expertise, more hands in the room. Hyde did none of this. He managed the situation himself. He kept the room calm. He spoke in the measured, professional tones of a man who had everything under control. And through the convulsions, through the terrible involuntary thrashing of a body at war with itself, Colonel Thomas Hunton Swope managed to speak. He managed to push words up through whatever was happening to him and deliver them to the room with a clarity that everyone present would remember for the rest of their lives. "I wish," the Colonel said, "I hadn't taken that damned medicine." Those were among his last coherent words. He died on October 3rd, 1909, 2 days after Moss Hunton. 2 deaths in 2 days, in the same household, both attended by the same physician, both following contact with that physician in the hours before the fatal event. Hyde's official diagnosis for the Colonel's death was cerebral hemorrhage, a stroke, an event caused by the rupture of a blood vessel in the brain, the kind of thing that killed old men with some regularity in that era, the kind of thing that required no particular explanation and raised no automatic suspicion. The Colonel was 80 years old. He had been in declining health. A cerebral hemorrhage was entirely plausible. It was, in fact, precisely the kind of diagnosis that was designed to be entirely plausible, that was designed to end the conversation before the conversation could properly begin. The funeral was arranged. The family gathered in the particular suspended state of grief that follows an expected death that has nonetheless arrived sooner than expected, and the Colonel was buried. and the house moved forward into mourning with the quiet dignity that families like the Swopes were expected to maintain in the face of loss. But Pearl Keller was still in the house, and Pearl Keller was thinking. She was not a dramatic woman. She was not given to speculation or to the particular pleasure that some people take in suspicion. She was a nurse, which meant that she had been trained to observe, to record, to distinguish between what she had directly witnessed and what she had inferred, and to hold those two categories separate in her mind with great care. She had directly witnessed the colonel's convulsions following the administration of the tablet. She had directly witnessed Hyde's decision not to summon additional medical assistance. She had directly witnessed the expression on Hyde's face in the minutes after the colonel died. These observations sat in her like stones. She did not act on them immediately. There was no framework in November of 1909 for a nurse to walk up to the local authorities and say, "I think the doctor killed the patient." There was no precedent for it, no established path, no form to fill out. What she had were observations and a feeling, and feelings were not evidence, and observations without context were easily explained away. She kept watching. She kept noting. She did her job, and she kept her face professionally neutral, and she waited, with the patience of someone who knows that the truth has a way of generating more of itself if you give it enough time. The rest of the family was grieving. Frances Hyde was grieving the loss of her uncle, the man who had been the gravitational center of her family, and she was also, presumably, managing the complicated interior life of a woman whose husband is the subject of thoughts she does not yet fully allow herself to have. The other nieces and nephews were grieving and also, in the way of all families confronted with the death of a wealthy patriarch, beginning the careful, delicate dance of the inheritance. Who would get what? Who had been close enough, loyal enough, loving enough to deserve the larger portions? How the residuary fund, that enormous, contested, million-dollar question, would ultimately be resolved. Hyde, meanwhile, was present. He was the doctor of the household. He continued to attend to the various family members who required medical attention. He was calm. He was professional. He was, to all visible appearances, in complete control of himself and his circumstances. If he felt any anxiety about what he had done, he did not show it in any way that the people around him were equipped to perceive. And then Thanksgiving arrived. Thanksgiving 1909 was not a holiday in the Swope household. It was the beginning of something else entirely. It was the moment when whatever Hyde had been building in secret, whatever quiet, methodical plan had been operating beneath the surface of the household's ordinary life, began to accelerate. Hyde and Frances arrived for the holiday gathering with gifts and food and the outward trappings of the family occasion. Hyde brought, among other things, bottled water. This was not unusual in itself. Bottled water was not uncommon in that era, particularly in households where the purity of the local water supply was a concern. What was notable, what would become deeply notable in retrospect, was that Hyde specifically offered the bottled water to some members of the household and not others. Some people drank from the cistern, the household's regular water supply. Some people drank what Hyde had brought. The line between those two groups would, within days, become the line between those who became violently ill and those who did not. Within a week of Thanksgiving, the typhoid cases began. Typhoid fever, for those who may not be familiar with it, is a bacterial infection caused by Salmonella typhi. It spreads primarily through contaminated food and water. In 1909, it was a serious and sometimes fatal illness, particularly in elderly or already weakened patients. Its symptoms are distinctive and progressive: a sustained high fever, abdominal pain, a characteristic rash, and, in severe cases, delirium and death. It was not, in 1909, a mysterious or unknown disease. Physicians recognized it immediately. They understood its mechanisms. And they understood, above all, that for typhoid fever to appear in a household, someone had to have introduced the bacteria. The illness moved through the Swope household with a focus that, in retrospect, looked less like an epidemic and more like a targeting system. One family member collapsed, then another, then a visitor who had stayed only briefly enough that if the contamination had come from the household's general water or food supply, their exposure would not have been sufficient to produce illness. Nurses who came to help were also affected. The pattern was consistent, and it was damning. The people who got sick were the people who had been close to Hyde. the people who had received care or food or water or medicine directly from his hands. Pearl Keller watched this unfold. She was no longer just thinking. She was beginning to act in the small, careful ways available to her. She was noting names and dates and symptoms in her memory with the precision of a woman who understood that she might one day be required to testify to what she had seen. She was watching Hyde's movements through the household with a new intensity, and she began to notice things that she had previously been able to explain away. She noticed that Hyde sometimes produced small capsules, that he administered them to patients in the private moments when other medical staff were occupied elsewhere, that the capsules were not always accounted for in any official medical record, that some patients who received these capsules became very ill very quickly, and that the progression of their illness did not always match the progression that the officially diagnosed typhoid fever would have predicted. She also learned something that changed everything she thought she knew. Before the Thanksgiving gathering, before the first family member had shown any sign of illness, before any of the events that were now unfolding in the Swope household had begun, Hyde had obtained cultures of typhoid bacteria from a physician named Dr. Stewart. He had requested them, he said, for research purposes. Dr. Stewart had provided them without particular suspicion, because physicians in that era sometimes obtained bacterial cultures for legitimate scientific study, and because Hyde presented the request in the calm, professional tones of a man who made perfectly ordinary requests. He had the bacteria before the outbreak began. He had the means of delivery. He had the access. And now the people around him were getting sick and dying in a pattern that followed no natural logic. Pearl Keller was no longer just a nurse watching a patient. She was a witness to something that she did not yet have full evidence to prove, but that she understood in her body the way you understand certain things before your mind has found the language for them. The family member who would die during this typhoid outbreak was named Chrisman Swope. He was one of the colonel's nephews. He was young, not elderly, not already weakened by decades of wear, but young and by all accounts healthy and full of the ordinary vitality of a man who had no particular reason to die. He received a capsule from Hyde. He convulsed. He died. Hyde attended a celebratory banquet that same evening. This is the detail that the people who would later study this case always found the most difficult to hold in their minds. Not the deaths themselves, not the poisoning, not even the cold methodical planning of it all, but this, that a man could watch a young person die in convulsions and then go to a banquet and eat and drink and make conversation and do it without visible discomfort, without the smallest crack in the surface of his ordinary sociability. It spoke to something in Hyde's interior life that the people around him were only beginning to understand existed. It was also, almost certainly, a mistake, because the banquet meant that people who would later be asked about Hyde's behavior on the night Chrisman died would be able to testify that he had been cheerful, that he had been relaxed, that he had shown no grief, no concern, no distress. In a courtroom, that testimony would land with tremendous weight. But the courtroom was still months away. The winter was still deepening over Kansas City. The snow was beginning to fall, and it was in the snow, in the specific, particular snow on a specific, particular night, that the next piece of evidence materialized, in a way so cinematic, so precisely dramatic, that if you read it in a novel you would consider it too convenient to be believed. One of the Swope family members, Tom Swope, another nephew, was outside in the winter dark, and through the snow and the darkness he saw Hyde, standing beneath a street lamp, and he saw Hyde looking at something in his hand, and he saw Hyde bring his foot down, deliberately and firmly, and crush whatever it was into the snow. Tom Swope waited until Hyde was gone. Then he walked to the place beneath the street lamp, and in the snow, where Hyde's foot had come down, he found fragments. Small fragments. The fragments of what had been a capsule. He collected them. He brought them inside. He held them to his nose and breathed in, carefully, the way you breathe in something that you are not entirely sure you want to smell, and what he smelled was something sharp and chemical and unmistakable. Something that a man who had grown up in Missouri in the last decades of the 19th century would have encountered in various industrial contexts, often enough to identify. Cyanide. The capsule smelled of cyanide. He did not throw the fragments away. He wrapped them with the careful deliberateness of a man who understands that he is holding something important. And the fragments went to a laboratory, and the laboratory confirmed what Tom Swope's nose had already told him. Cyanide on the capsule fragments. And when the vomit of one of the surviving ill family members, a young woman named Margaret, who had been given a capsule and had become violently sick but had survived, was also analyzed, the laboratory found something else. Strychnine, 2 poisons, 2 mechanisms. Cyanide in the capsule fragments from the snow. Strychnine in the surviving patient's vomit. Both administered by the same hands. Both present in a household that had just buried 2 men and was still watching several others fight for their lives. The Swope family was no longer grieving. They were no longer simply worried. They were, quietly, and with the particular horror of people who have understood something terrible, beginning to build a case. And somewhere in that house, Pearl Keller exhaled. Because what she had seen, and what she had known, and what she had been holding in careful silence was about to become something that the world outside the mansion would finally have to reckon with. But Hyde did not know that yet. Hyde was still the doctor of the household. Hyde was still the husband of Frances Swope. Hyde was still moving through the rooms of the mansion with the measured confidence of a man who believes that what he has done is hidden well enough to survive scrutiny. He was wrong, but he did not know how wrong he was. Not yet. And in the space between what Hyde believed about his safety and what was actually coming for him, a great many careful, patient people were preparing to dismantle everything he had built. The question was, would the evidence be strong enough? Would the science of 1909 be sufficient to prove in a court of law what the capsule fragments and the laboratory results and Pearl Keller's testimony and Tom Swope's account of the street lamp scene seemed, taken together, to indicate beyond any reasonable doubt? That question would take months to answer. It would take the most sensational trial that Kansas City had ever seen. It would take expert chemists and nurse testimonies and the tearing apart of a family on a public stage and a jury that deliberated for 3 days. But it would also produce an outcome that nobody fully expected. Not even the people who thought they knew exactly what justice required. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a household when the people inside it have begun to understand that something has gone very wrong, but have not yet found the words to say it out loud. It is not the silence of peace. It is not the silence of rest. It is the silence of held breath, of eyes that move carefully around a room, of conversations that stop a sentence too early because the next sentence would require someone to say the thing that nobody is quite ready to say yet. That silence had settled over the Swope mansion by December of 1909, and it had the weight and texture of a winter sky before snow. Heavy, pressing, full of something that was coming whether you were ready for it or not. The family had been through too much in too short a time. 2 deaths in 2 days in October. The typhoid outbreak that had swept through the household in November and December, touching nearly everyone who lived within its walls. Killing one of the colonel's nephews, sending others to their beds with fevers that climbed and crested and left survivors pale and diminished and shaken. And through all of it, the constant presence of Bennett Clark Hyde. At every bedside, in every medical conversation. His hands on every bottle of medicine, every capsule, every treatment decision that had been made in that house since the autumn began. The capsule fragments from the snow had changed things. Not officially, not yet, not in any way that the law had yet taken formal notice of, but inside the family, inside the private architecture of trust and suspicion that every family builds and maintains over years of shared living, something had fundamentally shifted. The fragments were being held. The laboratory results were being quietly processed. And the people who had access to this information were beginning to have conversations with each other that they would not have been capable of having even 2 weeks earlier. Conversations in which the word that hovered over every sentence, the word that nobody quite used directly, but that was present in every pause and every careful circumlocution, was murder. It was Frances's sister Margaret who first went to an attorney. Or rather, it was Margaret who had received the capsule and survived it, who had vomited in a way that had allowed her vomit to be collected and analyzed, and who was therefore walking around the Swope mansion in December of 1909 with the knowledge that she was alive because her body had expelled something that was designed to kill her. Whatever complicated feelings Margaret had about her sister's marriage, whatever loyalty or restraint had previously held her back from acting on her suspicions, they had been burned away by the experience of convulsing on a sickroom floor while Bennett Clark Hyde stood nearby with the expression that Pearl Keller had already noted and been unable to name. Margaret was not quiet about what she knew. Margaret was, in fact, remarkably clear-eyed and decisive for a woman who had nearly died and who was still recovering her strength. She spoke to people. She spoke to the right people. And those conversations led, through the careful chain of events that tends to characterize the opening of formal investigations, to the decision that the bodies of Thomas Hunton Swope and Moss Hunton and Chrisman Swope would need to be exhumed. The word exhumation has a heaviness to it that no euphemism can soften. To exhume a body is to disturb it, to pull it back from the place where it has been laid to rest, and to subject it to the particular cold science of forensic examination, to ask it questions that it cannot answer in words, but that its tissues and organs and chemistry may still be capable of answering if the right people ask in the right way. It is an act that the law treats as necessary and that families tend to experience as violent, regardless of the justifications offered. The Swope family authorized it. This in itself was remarkable. These were people who had just buried their patriarch, their nephew, their family's foundational figure, and they were now saying yes, open the graves, bring the bodies back, do what needs to be done. The weight of what they suspected was greater than the weight of their reluctance to disturb the dead. And that tells you something about where they were by December of 1909. That tells you something about how frightened they were and how certain. The autopsies were conducted by physicians brought in specifically for this purpose. Physicians who had no prior relationship with the Swope household and who could therefore approach the examination of the bodies without any conflict of interest, without any investment in a particular outcome. They were forensic specialists, or as close to forensic specialists as 1909 could produce. Men who understood the chemistry of the body and who knew what to look for when they were looking for evidence of poisoning. What they found, when they opened Colonel Thomas Hunton Swope, was not what a cerebral hemorrhage leaves behind. Hyde had diagnosed the colonel's death as a stroke, a cerebral hemorrhage. And the brain of a man who has died of a cerebral hemorrhage looks a specific way. It bears the marks of a blood vessel that is ruptured, the hemorrhagic signature of that catastrophic event. The colonel's brain did not look that way. The colonel's brain appeared, to the examining physicians, essentially normal. There was no evidence of the internal bleeding that a cerebral hemorrhage would have produced. There was nothing in the brain tissue that supported Hyde's diagnosis in any way that the examining physicians could identify. What there was, instead, was in the liver. The liver is the body's primary organ of chemical processing. It filters the blood. It metabolizes substances. And when a person has been poisoned, the liver tends to retain chemical evidence of that poisoning in ways that other organs do not, in ways that can survive weeks or even months in the soil, waiting with a patience that the poisoner did not anticipate for the moment when someone comes looking. The examining physicians found strychnine in the colonel's liver. Not a trace. Not an ambiguous signal that could be attributed to some other cause. A quantity of strychnine that the toxicologists who analyzed the tissue samples described as representing nearly double the dose that would be fatal to an adult man. Nearly double. The colonel had not merely been given enough strychnine to kill him. He had been given enough to kill him twice over, as though whoever administered it was either uncertain of the dose or was ensuring, with the cold thoroughness of someone who cannot afford to fail, that there would be no possibility of survival. Strychnine, for those who may not know its effects, produces death through a specific and terrible mechanism. It causes the muscles of the body to contract uncontrollably. It causes convulsions. It causes a kind of rigid, arching spasm of the entire body that physicians in that era recognized, and that has, since the 19th century, been one of the signature presentations of strychnine poisoning. Colonel Swope had convulsed violently in the minutes after taking the tablet Hyde had given him. He had convulsed so severely that everyone present had been frightened and shaken by what they witnessed. And he had said, through that convulsion, the words that would be quoted in newspapers across the country in the months to come. I wish I hadn't taken that damn medicine. He had known, in the animal, instinctual way that a body knows things before the mind has processed them. He had known that what was happening to him was connected to what had just entered him. He had died knowing, in some wordless, preconscious way, that he had been betrayed. The examination of Moss Hunton produced its own revelations. Hunton, you will remember, had collapsed at dinner and had been bled by Hyde well beyond the quantity that the other attending physician had specified as safe. When his brain was examined, the physicians found something that again contradicted the official medical narrative that had been constructed around his death. His brain was normal. There was no evidence of the disease process that had been cited as the cause of his collapse. And in his tissue samples, there were chemical signatures that were consistent with poisoning, though the specific compound was more difficult to isolate given the time that had passed since his death. Chrisman Swope, the nephew who had died during the typhoid outbreak, presented a different profile. His official cause of death had been attributed to the typhoid fever that was sweeping the household, with a secondary diagnosis of meningitis, inflammation of the membranes surrounding the brain. Hyde had cited the meningitis as the specific terminal event, but when the examining physicians opened Chrisman's skull and examined his brain, they found no evidence of meningitis. The brain tissue was normal. There was no inflammation. There was no disease process that matched what Hyde had described. But in the liver, as in the colonel's liver, there was strychnine, and in the blood, there were traces consistent with cyanide exposure. 3 bodies, 3 autopsies, 3 sets of findings that directly and systematically contradicted the medical diagnoses that Bennett Clark Hyde had provided. 3 bodies that carried chemical evidence of poisoning in organs that had been waiting, patiently, in the cold Missouri earth, to tell the truth that the living had not been able to fully articulate. Pearl Keller, when she heard what the autopsies had found, felt something that she later described as the particular cold satisfaction of a person who has been certain of something terrible and has finally been given the evidence to prove it. She had watched. She had waited. She had been careful and professional and restrained in a situation that must have required extraordinary self-control. And now the science had confirmed what her trained eyes and her careful observations had been telling her since the autumn began. She was ready to talk, and the investigators who came to the Swope mansion in December and January were very ready to listen. The coroner's inquest, which preceded the formal criminal proceedings, called witness after witness. The nurses, the family members, the other physicians who had been present at various points during the autumn's events. Dr. Twyman, who had told Hyde to stop bleeding Moss Hunton at 1 pint, and who had left the room believing his instruction would be followed. Dr. Stewart, who had provided Hyde with the typhoid cultures months before the outbreak, believing them to be for research purposes, and who now had to sit with the implications of that transaction. Hyde was called before the coroner as well. He was given the opportunity to explain himself, to provide context, to offer the alternative narratives that his defense would later elaborate on in the courtroom: the embalming fluid theory, the flies theory, the cockroach extermination theory. To present himself as the misunderstood physician, the man whose medical decisions had been unconventional but had been made in good faith, the man who was now being made a scapegoat for the natural deaths of a family whose patriarch was 80 years old and whose health had been in decline. Hyde declined to testify before the coroner. He exercised his right to silence, which was a right he was legally entitled to exercise, and which, in a courtroom, cannot be held against a defendant. But the coroner's inquest was not a courtroom, and in the broader social world of Kansas City in January 1910, Hyde's decision to say nothing read, to virtually everyone who heard of it, as the decision of a man who understood that whatever he might say would make things worse. The investigation had, by this point, been accumulating evidence for weeks. The capsule fragments from the snow and their laboratory analysis. Pearl Keller's observations of Hyde's behavior over months. The testimony of other nurses who had noted the mysterious capsules being administered in private moments. The account of the Thanksgiving gathering and the bottled water that Hyde had brought, and that some family members had drunk from, and some had not, and the subsequent alignment between who had drunk the water and who had become ill. The record of Hyde's visit to Dr. Stewart's laboratory to obtain typhoid cultures. The timeline of deaths, which had the cold precision of something planned rather than the ragged, uneven progression of natural mortality in a grieving household. And then there were the financial records. Because the investigation, as it deepened, began to examine not just the deaths but the context around the deaths, and the context included the Swope family will and the question of who stood to benefit from the specific deaths that had occurred in the specific order in which they had occurred. Moss Hunton had been the executor of the estate. His death created a vacancy. Hyde had immediately suggested himself to fill it. Colonel Swope had been contemplating leaving the residuary fund to charity. His death, before he had made that change, meant that the family, and specifically Hyde, through his wife Frances, inherited instead. Crispin Swope had been one of the primary beneficiaries of the will. His death redistributed his portion among the remaining heirs. The pattern was not random. The pattern, if you followed the money the way investigators were now following it, had a logic. A cold, patient, terrible logic that pointed in one direction and one direction only. Bennett Clark Hyde was arrested in January of 1910. He was taken into custody by the Kansas City authorities on a charge of murder in the first degree, specifically the murder of Thomas Hunton Swope. Additional charges followed: the murder of Crispin Swope and multiple counts of attempted murder for the family members who had received capsules and survived them. The indictments accumulated like a storm building over the city, and the newspapers, which had been following the investigation with the breathless attention of a press corps that understood it had a major story on its hands, reported each new development with increasing urgency. Hyde was led to the jail. He was photographed. He was, by all accounts, composed. He was the kind of man who could be composed at the worst moments because his composure was not a reflection of his emotional state, but a performance that he had practiced for so long that it had become habitual, involuntary, as automatic as breathing. But something had cracked. Something in the architecture of the story he had been telling about himself. The story of the competent, devoted, family physician who had done his best under difficult circumstances, had developed a fracture that no amount of composure could conceal. Because the bodies told a different story. The bodies told the truth in the specific, irrefutable language of chemistry, in the language of strychnine and cyanide found in liver tissue and vomit and capsule fragments, in the language of brains that showed no evidence of the diseases that had been cited as their owners' causes of death. The bodies had been patient. The bodies had waited in the cold ground for someone to come and ask the right questions in the right way. And when the right people had finally come with the right tools and the right knowledge, the bodies had answered. Frances Hyde, sitting in the house that her uncle had purchased for her and her husband, heard the news of the arrest and understood that her life had just changed in ways she was not yet fully able to imagine. She had been defending her husband privately, in the quiet conversations of a woman who loves someone and cannot bring herself to believe what the evidence around her suggests. She had been navigating the impossible position of a woman whose family suspected her husband and whose loyalty to that husband was in direct conflict with her loyalty to her family and with the evidence accumulating in front of her own eyes. What she felt in that moment, what she really felt, beneath whatever surface she showed to the people around her, is something that history cannot fully recover. But what she did, in the weeks and months that followed, would speak volumes about where she ultimately landed. The trial was set for the spring of 1910. Kansas City began to prepare itself for what the newspapers were already calling the trial of the century. Attorneys were assembled. Witnesses were prepared. Evidence was organized into the shape that the prosecution needed it to take in order to be presented to a jury of 12 men who would be asked to look at everything that had happened in the Swope mansion over the autumn and winter of 1909 and determine whether it added up to murder. It was a question that seemed, to most of the people who had been paying attention, to have an obvious answer. But the law is not always comfortable with obvious answers. The law requires proof of a specific kind, and the defense of a wealthy and well-connected physician in 1910 had resources that an ordinary defendant could not dream of. There were expert witnesses who would testify that cyanide could form naturally in embalming fluid. There were alternative theories, carefully constructed and confidently presented, for every piece of evidence the prosecution intended to bring forward. The courtroom would be the place where the truth and the law met each other, and whether they would agree was a question that nobody, in January of 1910, could answer with confidence. But the question was coming. Spring was coming, and with it, one of the most dramatic, most public, most bitterly contested courtroom battles that the American Midwest had ever produced. Hyde sat in his cell and waited. He was, by all accounts, calm. He was also, according to people who visited him in those weeks before the trial, already preparing his defense, already thinking several moves ahead, already operating, in the small room where the law had placed him, with the same patient deliberateness that had characterized every decision he had made since the autumn of 1905, when he had married Frances Swope in secret and begun his long, slow, terrible calculation of what her family's fortune was worth and what he was willing to do to obtain it. What he had done had been methodical. What the law would now do to him would need to be equally methodical. And in the spring of 1910, the methodical processes of American justice would grind into motion with the full weight of a city's horror and grief and outrage behind them. The question that nobody knew the answer to yet, the question that would not be answered for months, and whose answer would not satisfy everyone even when it finally arrived, was whether that weight would be enough. Whether truth, carefully assembled and skillfully presented, would be sufficient to overcome the resources of a man who had already demonstrated, in the most terrible possible way, what careful, patient, skillful deliberateness could accomplish. That question was about to be answered in the most public way imaginable, and the people of Kansas City were watching. The spring of 1910 came to Kansas City the way springs come to the Midwest, reluctantly at first, in the cold, bright mornings that feel more like a continuation of winter than a departure from it, and then all at once, in a rush of warmth and green that makes you forget, for a moment, everything that the previous season contained. The trees along the boulevards put out their new leaves. The Missouri River ran high and fast with the snowmelt from the north. People who had spent the winter months moving quickly between heated buildings began to slow down and look at the sky and breathe the particular sweetness of air that has turned. But in the courthouse, there was no spring. In the courthouse, it was still the autumn and winter of 1909, because that was the season the law was still working through, examining every hour of those months with the methodical patience of a process that does not care about the calendar outside its windows. Inside the courtroom where the state of Missouri versus Bennett Clark Hyde would be heard, the light was filtered and the air was close and the rows of benches were filled, every morning of every day of the trial, with the greatest concentration of human attention that Kansas City had ever directed at a single room. People came from across the city. People who had never met the Swopes and had no personal connection to the case came and sat and listened and watched, because the trial of Bennett Clark Hyde had taken on the quality of a civic event, something that transcended the specific facts of the specific case, and had become instead a referendum on questions that Kansas City and the country beyond it were deeply invested in. Questions about medicine and trust. Questions about money and marriage and the terrible things that people are capable of when the distance between ambition and action becomes very small. Questions about what a family owes its members and what its members owe each other. The attorneys entered the courtroom with the gravity of men who understood the historical weight of what they were doing. The prosecution was led by James Reed, a man whose courtroom presence had the particular quality of contained energy, the sense of a force being carefully directed rather than freely released. Reed was brilliant and precise, and he had spent the months since Hyde's arrest building a case that he believed was, at its core, simple. He had a dead man. He had a motive. He had physical evidence. He had witnesses. He had the testimony of science. The task, as he understood it, was to present these elements in a sequence that would be both intellectually compelling and emotionally comprehensible to a jury of 12 men who would need to feel the truth of what had happened as well as understand it. The defense was equally formidable. Hyde's attorneys were experienced, well-resourced, and deeply committed to the alternative narrative they had constructed around the events in the Swope mansion. Their version of the story was not a simple denial. Simple denial is the weakest form of legal defense, the version that juries find least convincing because it requires them to disbelieve everything they have heard without offering them anything to believe instead. Hyde's defense was more sophisticated than that. It was a version of the story in which every piece of evidence the prosecution presented had an innocent explanation, in which the deaths that had occurred in the Swope household were the natural and tragic consequences of an old man's age and a household's vulnerability to disease, in which Bennett Clark Hyde was not a murderer, but a physician who had made some unconventional decisions under difficult circumstances and was now being made to pay for them by a family that had always resented him, and that was using the legal system as an instrument of their personal animosity. It was a coherent story. It was a story that contained enough truth, enough genuine ambiguity, enough genuine scientific uncertainty to be taken seriously. And it was the story that Hyde's attorneys intended to tell, in the most authoritative and convincing way they could manage, to 12 men who would decide whether their client lived the rest of his life as a free man or in a prison cell. The courtroom filled. The judge took his seat. The jury was selected with the careful deliberateness that high-stakes trials require. 12 men whose biographies and temperaments and relationships to the Swope family and to the medical profession were examined and weighed and argued over until a panel was assembled that both sides believed they could work with. Then the opening statements began, and the trial of the century was officially underway. James Reed opened for the prosecution with a speech that the newspapers would describe the following morning as one of the most compelling opening arguments ever delivered in a Missouri courtroom. He did not begin with the evidence. He began with the Colonel. He described Thomas Hunton Swope the way a man describes someone he genuinely admires. The Kentucky boy who came to Kansas City with vision and patience and the particular courage of someone who is willing to bet everything on something that everyone else considers worthless. He described the park. He described the fortune. He described the family. He built the Colonel up, in the minds of the jury, into the kind of figure whose death deserved the full weight of the law's attention. A man who had given his city something permanent and beautiful. A man who had trusted the wrong person with his life. Then Reed turned to Hyde, and the warmth left his voice, not with drama, not with the theatrical shift that would have seemed manipulative, but quietly, with the simple factual neutrality of a man setting down something heavy and letting its weight speak for itself. He described Hyde's background, the grave robbing allegations, the suspension from his position as police surgeon, the secret marriage, the financial stakes. He described what had happened to Moss Hunton, and what had happened to the Colonel, and what had happened during the typhoid outbreak, and he described all of it in the precise chronological sequence that made the pattern unmistakable, the pattern of a man moving through a household and leaving a trail of dead people whose deaths all served the same financial purpose. He told the jury what the autopsies had found. He told them about the strychnine in the Colonel's liver. He told them about the cyanide in the capsule fragments from the snow. He told them about the typhoid cultures that Hyde had obtained before the outbreak began. He told them about Pearl Keller. He told them about Tom Swope watching Hyde crush a capsule under his foot in the winter darkness beneath a street lamp, and about the smell of cyanide rising from the snow where Hyde's foot had come down. By the time Reed sat down, the courtroom was very quiet. The particular quiet of people who have been shown something they cannot unsee. The defense opened with a different approach. Where Reed had been direct and sequential, Hyde's lead attorney was discursive and philosophical, beginning not with facts but with the concept of reasonable doubt. He reminded the jury, carefully and at length, that the law did not require them to be certain of Hyde's innocence. It required the state to prove his guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And reasonable doubt, he suggested, was everywhere in this case. The science was uncertain. The timelines were ambiguous. The witnesses had their own agendas and their own connections to the Swope family and their own reasons to want a particular outcome. The autopsies had been conducted by physicians who had been hired by people who already believed Hyde was guilty. The laboratory analyses had been performed under conditions of institutional pressure. Everywhere you looked in this case, the defense attorney suggested, you found not the clean certainty of proven fact but the murky, contested territory of interpretation. He described the embalming fluid theory. This was one of the defense's central scientific arguments, and it was not entirely without merit, which was precisely why it was chosen. Potassium cyanide, the defense's chemistry experts would testify, can be produced under certain conditions during the embalming process, as a byproduct of the chemical reactions between the embalming compounds and the tissue of the body. If the autopsies had found cyanide in the tissue samples, the defense would argue that cyanide may have been produced by the embalming process itself rather than introduced before death. It was an argument that required a jury to understand some fairly complex organic chemistry, and the defense understood that jurors who cannot follow a technical argument tend to default to uncertainty, and uncertainty, in a criminal trial, is the defendant's best friend. He described the flies theory. Typhoid fever, the defense would argue, spreads through contaminated water and food, but it can also spread through flies, which carry the bacteria from infected sources to food and water supplies without anyone introducing it deliberately. The outbreak in the Swope household could have been a natural occurrence, the defense would suggest, a tragic but entirely explicable public health event of the kind that had devastated households and communities across America throughout the preceding decades. He described the cockroach extermination theory. The cyanide, he would argue, was present in the household for entirely innocent reasons. It was used, as it was used in many households of that era to control vermin. The capsule fragments that Tom Swope had found in the snow and identified as smelling of cyanide might have been entirely unrelated to any medical treatment. Might have been one of dozens of ordinary household items that contained cyanide compounds for perfectly legitimate purposes. It was a performance of alternative explanation, a demonstration of the defense's ability to take each piece of evidence and hold it up to a different light and show the jury a version of it that did not require them to conclude that Bennett Clark Hyde was a murderer. And it was delivered with the confidence and fluency of a man who had been in courtrooms before and who knew exactly what effect he was aiming for. Then the witnesses began. Pearl Keller took the stand, and the courtroom leaned forward collectively, the way an audience leans forward when the person they have been waiting for finally appears. She was, by all accounts, exactly what she appeared to be, a nurse, a professional woman, a person who had spent her career in circumstances that required composure and precision and the ability to observe accurately under pressure. She sat in the witness box and she answered every question in the clear, measured tones of someone who is telling the truth and knows it and is not frightened of the implications. She described everything she had seen, the tablet and the convulsions, Hyde's face in the minutes after the colonel died, the mysterious capsules administered in private moments, the pattern of who got sick and when and following what contact with Hyde. She described it all with a specificity of detail that comes only from someone who was actually present and actually paying attention, the kind of specificity that is very difficult to fabricate because fabricated testimony tends to be either too vague or too precise, while genuine memory has the particular texture of reality, the texture of specific sensory details that nobody would have thought to invent. The defense cross-examined her vigorously. They questioned her training. They questioned her ability to accurately assess what she had seen in a situation that was medically complex and emotionally fraught. They suggested that her account had been influenced by what she had subsequently learned, that she was fitting her memories to a narrative rather than reporting what she had actually observed in real time. They tried to find inconsistencies between what she said on the stand and what she had said in earlier statements, and they found some. Small ones, the ordinary inconsistencies that exist in any honest person's account of events observed under stress. And they held those inconsistencies up and examined them with the meticulous attention of people who understand that a jury watching a witness struggle to reconcile small discrepancies may begin to question the larger account. Pearl Keller held. She acknowledged the small inconsistencies without apology and without defensiveness, in the straightforward way of someone who understands that perfect consistency in testimony is actually a sign of rehearsal rather than honesty. She said, more than once, the most powerful thing a witness can say in a courtroom: I am telling you what I saw. I am not telling you what it means. I am telling you what I saw. Dr. Twyman testified about his instruction to Hyde to stop the bleeding of Moss Hunton at 1 pint, and about his understanding that his instruction had been followed, and about his subsequent shock when he learned that Hyde had continued well beyond the limit specified. He was a credible witness in the specific way that physicians tend to be credible witnesses, authoritative without being arrogant, technically precise without being incomprehensible, clearly distressed by what he was describing without allowing that distress to compromise the accuracy of his account. Dr. Stewart testified about the typhoid cultures. He described the request Hyde had made, the professional context in which it had been made, his own belief at the time that the request was legitimate, and his subsequent reckoning with what that request might have been for. He was a careful witness, a man who understood the professional gravity of what he was saying, who was clearly uncomfortable with the implications of his own testimony, but who was too honest to shade it in a direction that might have been more comfortable. The nurses who had cared for the family members during the typhoid outbreak described the capsules. They described Hyde's presence and absence at specific moments during specific patients' illnesses. They described things they had observed that had seemed, at the time, slightly unusual but not alarming, and that had only cohered into a pattern when considered in light of everything that had subsequently emerged. They were not individually devastating witnesses. Their testimony was the kind of testimony that accumulates rather than strikes, that builds its effect through repetition and corroboration rather than through any single dramatic revelation. The chemists were the most technically complex element of the prosecution's case, and also, in some ways, the most powerful. The laboratory analysts who had examined the capsule fragments, the tissue samples, the vomit collected from Margaret, took the stand and explained their findings in the precise language of forensic chemistry, translating the molecular evidence into terms that the jury could follow and evaluate. Strychnine in the liver, cyanide on the capsule fragments, consistent with the chemical profiles of the specific compounds that had been widely available through medical channels in 1909. And then there was the financial testimony. The attorneys and administrators who had been involved in the management of the Swope estate described the structure of the will, the amounts involved, the significance of the residuary fund, and the ways in which the specific deaths that had occurred had altered the distribution of the fortune. This testimony was perhaps the driest element of the prosecution's case, but it was also in some ways the most clarifying, because it answered the question that underlies every murder trial before it is ever asked out loud. Why? Why would a man do this? What could possibly be worth the risk, worth the calculation, worth the terrible weight of what had been done in that house? The financial testimony answered the question in the most direct possible way. $3.5 million. That was why. That was the calculation. That was the weight that Bennett Clark Hyde had placed on the other side of the scale from 3 human lives and had determined, in the privacy of his own mind, was worth more. The defense presented its witnesses with equal organization and equal confidence. Chemistry experts testified about the embalming fluid theory, carefully explaining the conditions under which cyanide compounds can form as a byproduct of the preservation process, acknowledging under cross-examination that those conditions were not always present and not always sufficient to produce the concentrations found, but insisting that the possibility could not be ruled out. Medical experts testified about the natural progression of typhoid fever and the legitimacy of Hyde's diagnoses. Character witnesses testified to Hyde's professional standing, his reputation in the medical community, the opinions of colleagues and peers who had worked alongside him and who believed him to be a competent and ethical physician. And then Hyde himself took the stand. This was the moment the courtroom had been waiting for. This was the moment that the crowds of spectators, the reporters filling their notebooks with careful shorthand, the family members seated in their designated section of the gallery, had been anticipating since the trial began. The defendant himself, the man at the center of everything, sitting in the witness box and facing the jury directly and telling his own story in his own words. Hyde was composed. He was, by the accounts of every reporter who described his testimony, almost eerily composed, the kind of composed that reads differently depending on how you interpret what composure means in a context like this. To some observers, it was the composure of an innocent man who has nothing to hide and is not afraid of the truth. To others, it was something colder. Something that had the quality of calculation rather than conscience. He described his medical decisions in the autumn of 1909 as the honest decisions of a physician doing his best under difficult circumstances. He described the bleeding of Moss Hunton as a legitimate medical procedure that he had believed was appropriate given Hunton's condition. He described the tablet he had given the colonel as a genuine attempt to address a genuine symptom. He described his presence during the typhoid outbreak as the presence of a dedicated physician working around the clock to care for a family in crisis. He was fluent. He was detailed. He was, on the surface, persuasive. And then James Reed stood up to cross-examine him. Reed had been waiting. Reed had been listening to Hyde's direct testimony with the focused attention of a man who is not simply hearing words, but is mapping them against everything he knows, noting every assertion, every timeline, every claim that can be checked against the evidence. And when he rose and began his cross-examination, it became quickly apparent that he had found the threads. The threads in Hyde's account that, when pulled, caused the fabric of the story to come apart. He asked Hyde about the typhoid cultures. He asked Hyde to explain, precisely and specifically, what legitimate research purpose had required him to obtain live typhoid cultures in the weeks before a typhoid outbreak struck the household in which he was the treating physician. Hyde's answer was careful, but it was also evasive in a way that the jury could see. He described research interests that did not quite cohere, professional purposes that were not quite specific enough to be convincing. Reed pulled the thread a little further. He asked about the capsules. He asked Hyde to account for specific capsules that nurses had described observing him administer to specific patients at specific times. Hyde denied some of the instances. He offered alternative explanations for others. But the alternative explanations required the jury to disbelieve the nurses, the multiple independent nurses who had all described similar observations without having coordinated their accounts, and the cumulative weight of those accounts was not easy to dismiss. Reed asked about the Thanksgiving gathering and the bottled water. He asked Hyde to explain why he had brought bottled water for some family members while others drank from the cistern, and why the subsequent pattern of illness aligned so precisely with that division. Hyde said the water was brought as a courtesy. Reed asked whether it was a coincidence that the people who drank Hyde's water were the ones who got sick. Hyde said it appeared to be. Reed asked whether Hyde understood how that appeared to the jury. Hyde's attorney objected. The jury noticed. And then Reed asked about the night in the snow. About what Hyde had been crushing under his foot beneath the street lamp. About the capsule fragments. About the cyanide smell. Hyde denied that the capsule contained cyanide. He denied that what he had crushed was medically significant. He offered an explanation that was, in its specifics, impossible to verify and impossible to disprove. But the jury was watching his face. And his face, which had been composed through every other moment of the trial, was doing something different under Reed's cross-examination. Not breaking, not visibly cracking, but working. The composure was still there, but it was working now. It was being maintained rather than being natural, and the difference was visible to 12 men who had been sitting in that courtroom for weeks watching a man's face and learning, the way jurors learn things, the particular grammar of that face. One juror, in an account he gave to a newspaper after the verdict was delivered, described the moment he knew. He described watching Hyde's face during Reed's cross-examination and seeing, in the fraction of a second between a question and an answer, something that he described as the expression of a man who is choosing what to say rather than remembering what happened. He said that was the moment, not the science, not the witnesses. Hyde's own face, in that fraction of a second, was what convinced him. The closing arguments were long and powerful on both sides. Reed told the jury that the evidence pointed in one direction and one direction only, and that the direction it pointed was toward a man who had cold-bloodedly murdered 3 members of his wife's family in order to secure a fortune that he had no legitimate claim to. He asked them to hold that man accountable. He asked them to give the Colonel and Chrisman and Moss Hunton the justice that the law existed to provide. The defense told the jury that doubt was everywhere and that reasonable men could not, in good conscience, send a man to prison for life based on evidence that was, at its core, circumstantial and contested and subject to multiple legitimate interpretations. They reminded the jury of their obligation. They appealed to their sense of the law's demands. The jury retired to deliberate. They were out for 3 days. 3 days of 12 men in a room with all of the evidence, all of the testimony, all of the photographs and chemical analyses and witness accounts. 3 days of arguments and disagreements, and the particular difficulty of 12 people trying to reach a unanimous decision about something that one of them would later describe as the hardest thing he had ever been asked to do. And then they came back. The foreman stood. The courtroom was absolutely silent. The kind of silence that has physical weight, the kind of silence that you can feel pressing against your eardrums. Guilty. The word landed in the courtroom like something dropped from a great height. Frances Hyde, seated in the gallery, closed her eyes. The Swope family members present exhaled, some of them audibly. The reporters' pens were already moving. Hyde received the verdict with the composure that had characterized his entire public presentation throughout the proceedings, but those who were watching closely described seeing something change in his eyes. Something that might have been, in a different man, relief. But in Hyde's eyes it looked like calculation, like a man who had already begun to think about the next move. The sentence was life imprisonment. Hyde was taken from the courtroom. Kansas City breathed. The newspapers declared justice served. The Swope family, devastated and exhausted, and still grieving in the complicated way of people who have lost both their loved ones and their sense of safety in the world, tried to understand what it meant to be on the other side of the trial. To have the verdict they had sought and to find that the verdict did not, in fact, bring back anyone they had lost. But the story was not over. It was, in fact, not even close to over. Because the law had more to say on the subject of Bennett Clark Hyde, and what it had to say would not be what anyone expected. The verdict had been delivered. The sentence had been pronounced. The courtroom had delivered its judgment, and the city had received it, and the newspapers had reported it, and the families had begun, tentatively, to think about what life looked like on the other side of this. And then the Missouri Supreme Court began to read the trial record. What they found when they read it would change everything. And nobody, not the prosecution, not the family, not the 12 men who had spent 3 days reaching the verdict that the city had celebrated, saw it coming. There is something that the law does that ordinary life does not do. And it is this: the law looks backward. Long after the moment of crisis is past, long after the grief has settled into its quieter, more permanent form, long after the city has exhaled and the newspapers have moved on to the next story and the families have begun the slow, painful work of reconstruction, the law continues to examine what happened in that courtroom. It reads the transcript. It reviews the rulings. It measures every decision made by the judge, every objection sustained or overruled, every instruction given to the jury against the standard of what the law requires. And sometimes, not often, but sometimes, it finds that the standard was not met. That something in the machinery of justice, something procedural and technical and invisible to the people in the gallery who were watching a human drama unfold, had failed to operate correctly. When that happens, the law does a thing that feels, to the people most affected by it, like a kind of cruelty. It undoes what has been done. It reaches back into the verdict that everyone believed was settled, and it pulls at a thread, and the thread unravels, and what had seemed finished and resolved becomes unfinished and unresolved again, becomes a wound that had begun to close and is now open again, and the people who are living with that wound have to find a way to bear the reopening. This is what the Missouri Supreme Court did to the Swope case in the months after the guilty verdict was delivered in the spring of 1910. The justices of the Missouri Supreme Court did not reopen the case because they believed Hyde was innocent. They were not making a statement about whether strychnine had been found in the colonel's liver or whether cyanide had been present in the capsule fragments or whether Pearl Keller had told the truth on the witness stand. They were not, in the particular and limited sense in which courts of appeal operate, concerned with the facts of the case at all. They were concerned with the process, with whether the trial that had produced the guilty verdict had been conducted in accordance with the requirements that the law imposed on criminal proceedings, and whether every ruling made by the trial court had been correct according to those requirements. And they found that not everything had been correct. The specific errors that the Missouri Supreme Court identified were technical. They were the kind of errors that require a legal education to fully appreciate, the kind of errors that make perfect sense within the framework of appellate jurisprudence and that seem, to anyone outside that framework, almost deliberately perverse. Some of the testimony that had been admitted at trial, the court determined, should not have been admitted. Some of the evidence that the jury had been allowed to consider had been obtained or presented in ways that the rules of evidence did not permit. The judge had made rulings during the trial, rulings that had seemed, to everyone in the courtroom at the time, like ordinary exercises of judicial discretion, that the Supreme Court now determined had been erroneous. The conviction was overturned. The news arrived in Kansas City the way certain kinds of news arrive, not with the drama of a sudden shock, but with the slow, terrible unfolding of something that you understand piece by piece, and that becomes worse with each piece you understand. The Swope family heard it in stages. The attorneys heard it in stages. The general public, which had been following the case since the investigation began, and which had formed a strong and largely unanimous opinion about what had happened in the Swope mansion and who was responsible for it, heard it in stages too. And in each stage, the reaction was the same. Disbelief, followed by a kind of hollow outrage, followed by the exhausted resignation of people who have been fighting for a long time and have been told that they must fight again. Frances Hyde was still in the city. She had maintained her support for her husband through the trial, or at least she had maintained the public appearance of support, which in a case this public was the only kind of support that most people could see. She had sat in the gallery. She had been present through the testimony and the arguments and the verdict. She had navigated the impossible position of a woman whose husband had been convicted of murdering her uncle and her nephew, whose family believed her husband was a killer, and whose own private understanding of the truth was something that only she could fully know. When the conviction was overturned, the family's attention returned to Frances with a particular intensity, because Frances was the hinge. She was the connection between Hyde and the Swope fortune. She was the person through whom Hyde's access to the family had been established, and through whom his motive had been defined. What Frances believed, and what Frances did, was going to matter enormously to what happened next. Hyde was released from custody pending retrial. He walked out of the jail in Kansas City into a city that looked at him with the particular complicated gaze of a community that believes someone is guilty and has watched the law fail to hold them accountable. There were no celebrations. There were no supporters gathered to welcome him. There was instead the cold, particular silence of people who have made up their minds and are simply watching to see what the legal formalities will ultimately produce. Hyde returned to Frances. Or rather, Hyde returned to the house, and Frances was in it. And they resumed some form of the domestic arrangement that the autumn of 1909 and the events that followed had suspended but had not yet formally ended. What passed between them in private, what conversations, what accusations, what silences, is something that history cannot recover. But the texture of that domestic situation can be imagined by any person who has ever been in a relationship in which something enormous and unspoken has taken up permanent residence between two people, in which the ordinary furniture of shared life sits unchanged while the atmosphere has become unbreathable. The prosecution announced its intention to retry Hyde. There would be a second trial. The state was not conceding that the overturned conviction meant Hyde was innocent. It meant only that the first trial had been procedurally flawed and that the case needed to be tried again in a way that corrected those flaws. The second trial was scheduled. The attorneys prepared again. The witnesses, many of whom had already given their testimony once and had spent months afterward trying to return to ordinary life, were told to prepare to do it again. The second trial began and then produced its own complications. There were hung juries. There were additional procedural issues. There were delays and continuances and the grinding, exhausting machinery of a legal process that was being operated on a case that everyone involved was deeply tired of. A case that had consumed enormous resources of time and money and emotional energy, and that was showing no signs of resolving itself cleanly. Through all of this, Hyde was a free man. A free man under the shadow of pending charges. A free man whose career had been destroyed. A free man whose name had become synonymous in the Missouri public mind with something that he had never been finally convicted of, but that virtually everyone believed him to have done. He could not practice medicine. Not because the law had taken his license. The legal situation was too unresolved for that formal sanction, but because no one would come to him as a patient. Because the reputation that a physician's practice is built upon had been burned to the ground in the most public possible way and would never be rebuilt. Because the name Bennett Clark Hyde now meant something specific and terrible to the people of Kansas City, and no amount of legal maneuvering could change what it meant. He was, in a sense that the law had not yet formally produced, but that his circumstances had already practically imposed, a man who had lost everything. He began to drink. This was reported by people who encountered him in the years after the trials. People who described a man who was visibly diminished from the composed, carefully presented figure who had sat in the courtroom. The composure had been the armor, and the armor had been designed for a specific kind of battle. And now that the battle had shifted into a different terrain, not the formal terrain of the courtroom where performance and precision were the tools, but the informal terrain of ordinary daily life, where reputation and trust and the goodwill of other people were the currency. The armor did not fit anymore. And without it, what was underneath was not what the armor had suggested. Frances was watching this. Frances had been watching her husband for years with the complicated attention of a woman who loves someone and simultaneously cannot fully trust what she sees in them. And what she saw in the years after the conviction and the reversal and the retrials was a man who was disintegrating, whose internal structure was failing, whose ability to maintain the surface that he had always maintained was declining with each month that passed. There came a point, a specific point, though the exact moment is not recoverable from the historical record, when Frances made a decision. When she looked at what her life had become and what the man she had married had cost her, not just in the loss of her uncle and her nephew and the devastation of her family, but in the destruction of her own life, her own reputation, her own sense of safety and trust in the world, and she decided that she was done. She divorced him. The divorce was not a surprise to anyone who had been paying attention. It was, in fact, remarkable that it had taken as long as it did. Remarkable that Frances had maintained the form of the marriage through the investigations and the trials and the retrials and all the public agony that had accompanied them. But when it came, It came with a finality that felt definitive in a way that the legal proceedings never quite had. The law had been uncertain about Bennett Clark Hyde. The law had convicted him and then unconvicted him, had tried him and retried him, and produced results that were ambiguous and contested and unresolved. But Frances was not the law. Frances was a woman who had access to a kind of knowledge about her husband that the law could not subpoena, and whatever that knowledge told her, it was enough. She left. She took what was hers by right of the inheritance she had received as Thomas Hunton Swope's niece, and she rebuilt her life with the particular quiet determination of a woman who has survived something that should have destroyed her and has decided that survival is enough, that it is in fact more than enough, that it is a kind of triumph even if it does not look like one from the outside. Hyde was alone. The charges against him were eventually, after years of legal proceedings that had produced no final, sustainable conviction, dismissed. The state of Missouri did not formally acquit him. The charges were not resolved by a finding of innocence. They were simply dropped, in the exhausted, anticlimactic way that cases sometimes end when the legal system has depleted its resources and its patience, and has concluded that the path to a final sustainable conviction has become too expensive and too uncertain to continue pursuing. Legally, Bennett Clark Hyde was a free man. Legally, he had never been finally convicted of anything. Legally, there was no formal finding that he had murdered 3 members of his wife's family or attempted to murder several others. The law, in its particular and limited way, had declined to produce the definitive accounting that the events in the Swope mansion seemed to demand. But legally free and actually free are not the same thing. And Bennett Clark Hyde discovered this with a thoroughness that the law's formal inability to convict him could not ameliorate. He moved. He tried to start again in a new place, in the way that people who have destroyed their lives in one location sometimes imagine that a change of geography will change the nature of their circumstances. He went to a small town. He tried to practice medicine again, because medicine was the only profession he had, the only set of skills he possessed that could generate an income. And for a brief time, in a place where his name was not yet known, he found a few patients willing to see him. Then his name became known. Then the stories arrived, as stories always arrive in small communities, carried by people who had read the newspapers or who had heard from people who had read the newspapers, and the small, careful professional life he had begun to rebuild collapsed again. The patients stopped coming. The practice closed. Hyde moved again. He was chasing something that could not be caught. He was trying to become anonymous in a country that had watched his trial in newspapers from coast to coast, in a time before the concept of rehabilitated public reputation existed in any meaningful way, in circumstances that had made his name a kind of shorthand for something that people who had never met him nonetheless felt they understood completely. He lived another 2.5 decades. He died in 1934, more than 20 years after the events in the Swope mansion, in circumstances that were modest and solitary and very far from the glittering orbit of wealth and influence that he had spent his life trying to enter. He was not mourned publicly. The newspapers that covered his death noted his passing with the brief, factual dispassion of journalists recording the end of a story rather than the death of a person. He was buried. He left no legacy of any kind that the public record preserves. The children he might have had, the career he might have built, the life he might have lived had he been a different kind of man. All of that was gone, consumed in the autumn and winter of 1909 in a mansion in Kansas City where the fires had burned and the silver had been polished and everything had looked, from the outside, like exactly what it was supposed to be. The Swope family continued. It was diminished and changed and permanently scarred by what had happened to it, but it continued in the way that families do, because families have a kind of institutional momentum that individual catastrophes slow but rarely stop entirely. The children of the nieces and nephews grew up in the shadow of the story, in the particular complicated shadow of a family tragedy that had also been a national news event, and they carried that shadow with them the way people carry the weight of their family's history, without always being fully conscious of it, but never entirely free of it either. Swope Park remained. The 1,400 acres that Colonel Thomas Hunton Swope had donated to the city of Kansas City in the gesture that had defined his public legacy remained exactly as they had been, green and permanent, and visited by ordinary people who knew the park's name, but may or may not have known the story of the man whose name it bore, or the story of what had happened to that man in the autumn of his life, when someone he trusted had decided that his fortune was more valuable than his remaining years. The park endures. It endures in the way that acts of genuine generosity tend to endure, outlasting the complicated human circumstances that surrounded them, surviving the revelation of everything ugly and violent that the human beings around them were capable of, remaining simply and stubbornly itself. Green in summer, gold and red in autumn, white in the Missouri winters, visited by children and families and old people and young people who spread blankets on the grass and look up at the sky and breathe the particular air of a place that was given to them by someone who understood, in some fundamental way, that there are things more important than money. Colonel Swope had understood that. He had understood it well enough to give away 1,400 acres of land that was worth millions, to say to the city that had made him wealthy, "Here, this is yours. This is my gift to you, and to your children, and to everyone who comes after you." He had understood that the legacy of a life is not measured in the fortune it accumulates, but in the things it leaves behind that matter to people who never knew you. What he had not understood, in the particular blindness of a man who had spent his life dealing with real estate and financial abstractions, was the specific danger that his fortune represented to the people closest to him. He had not understood that the very wealth he had spent his life building had made him a target in his own household. Had not understood that the man sitting at his table, the man his niece had married, the man who brought him medicine and spoke to him in the measured, professional tones of a caring physician, had done the arithmetic of that fortune and had arrived at conclusions that should have been unthinkable, but were not. The colonel had trusted. That is the thing that stays with you, when you have spent enough time with this story and turned it over enough times in your mind. He had trusted in the way that old people trust the people who take care of them, in the way that patients trust their physicians, in the way that families trust the members they have chosen to welcome into their circle. He had trusted, and that trust had been the instrument of his death, and there is something in that fact that is both heartbreaking and deeply, persistently human. Because trust is not a weakness. Trust is what makes it possible to live in community with other people. Trust is what makes families possible and care possible, and the whole beautiful, complicated enterprise of human interdependence possible. The fact that trust can be exploited does not make it wrong to extend it. The fact that Bennett Clark Hyde existed does not mean that Colonel Swope should have lived his final years in suspicion and isolation. The lesson of this story is not that we should trust less. The lesson of this story is about what we lose when someone violates the thing that makes human life bearable, and about the particular ugliness of a mind that looks at love and care and family and sees in them only a mechanism to be exploited. The Kansas City that had watched the trial and debated the verdict and been outraged by the reversal eventually moved on, as cities always do. New stories arrived. New scandals and tragedies and triumphs demanded the attention that the Swope case had commanded. The courtroom where Hyde was tried found other defendants. The newspapers that had filled their front pages with the details of the investigation and the testimony turned those pages over to other events, other people, other dramas. But the case did not disappear from the consciousness of the people who had lived through it. It did not disappear from the consciousness of the legal community, which debated its procedural lessons for decades. It did not disappear from the medical community, which used it in discussions about physician ethics and the particular dangers of trust in the patient-physician relationship. It did not disappear from the women's community, which had followed Frances Hyde's impossible situation with the particular attentiveness of women who understood, at some visceral level, the position of a woman married to a man who is not what he presented himself to be. And it did not disappear from the collective memory of Kansas City itself. It persisted, the way the most significant local stories persist, as a reference point, a touchstone, something that people invoked when they were trying to understand other things, when they were trying to make sense of betrayal or greed, or the specific horror of violence disguised as care. The story was told and retold. It was written about and analyzed and debated. It became one of those cases that true crime enthusiasts discover and then cannot let go of, because it contains within it all the elements that make a case impossible to fully resolve in the mind. The evidence that seems conclusive. The legal outcome that refuses to be conclusive. The central figure who maintains his composure to the end and takes whatever he knows with him when he dies. The family that survives but is never the same. The city that watches and cannot look away. It contains, too, the particular quality of unfinished justice that haunts the people who study it. The chemistry was there. The witnesses were there. The motive was there, massive and undeniable, written in the language of millions of dollars, and a will that had been altered by death in ways that consistently benefited one person. And yet the law, in its particular and limited way, had been unable to produce a final, sustained accounting. Was Bennett Clark Hyde guilty? The question is not difficult to answer if you look at the totality of what the historical record contains. The pattern is too consistent. The evidence is too specific. The behavior is too precisely aligned with the outcomes that each death produced. The deliberate, methodical quality of it, the obtaining of the typhoid cultures, the administration of capsules in private moments, the Thanksgiving gathering with its carefully distributed water, the capsule crushed under a boot in the snow, has the texture of planning rather than coincidence. But guilty and legally convicted are not the same thing. And in the American legal system, which is built on the principle that the failure to convict beyond a reasonable doubt is preferable to the conviction of an innocent person, Hyde's legal status remained, at the end of his life, formally unresolved. The colonel had said, with the clarity of a dying man, "I wish I hadn't taken that damned medicine." He had known. He had known in the instant that his body began its terrible response to what had been given to him. And in knowing, and in finding the words to say it even as the convulsions came, he had left behind the most human and most haunting piece of testimony in the entire case. Not a laboratory report, not a legal brief, not a nurse's careful account of what she had observed. Just an old man's voice, rising through whatever was happening to him, reaching for the one thing that might still matter. The truth. He wanted to say the truth before he lost the ability to say anything at all. And in those few words, in the grammar of a man who is 80 years old and dying and wants someone to know what happened to him, he gave the world something that no amount of legal maneuvering could entirely erase. He said what had been done to him. He said it clearly. He said it in a voice that everyone in that room would hear for the rest of their lives. In a voice that traveled from a bedroom in a Kansas City mansion in October of 1909 all the way to this moment. All the way to wherever you are right now, lying in the dark with your blanket pulled close, listening to a story that is 115 years old and still not finished. Still not entirely resolved. Still carrying within it the weight of what was done and the weight of what was not. Ultimately, fully answered for. Take a breath. You are safe where you are. The world outside is quiet. The winter that fell on Kansas City in 1909 has thawed and returned and thawed again more times than anyone now living can remember. The park that bears Colonel Swope's name is still there, the grass still green, the paths still welcoming. The gift he gave his city still intact, still visited, still maturing. The dead are at rest. Whatever peace was available to them, they have it. And the story continues. Because there is more. There are people we have not yet fully met. Threads we have not yet fully followed, corners of this case that the daylight has not yet fully reached. We are not done yet. Not by a long way. Stay with us. There is a particular kind of woman that history tends to overlook. Not because she is unimportant. Often she is the most important person in the story, but because her importance operates in a register that the official record does not always know how to capture. She is not the villain. She is not the victim, at least not in the straightforward way that the law defines victimhood. She is not the detective or the prosecutor or the witness whose testimony turns the case. She is something harder to categorize and therefore harder to remember. She is the woman in the middle. The woman around whom everything turns without anyone quite acknowledging that she is the axis. Frances Swope Hyde was that woman. She had been born into wealth and into the particular expectations that wealth imposes on women of a certain era and a certain social position. She was expected to be gracious and composed and appropriately educated and eventually appropriately married, and to manage her household and her social obligations with the quiet efficiency that well-bred women of her time were trained to deliver so seamlessly that nobody would think to call it work. She was expected to be an ornament and an organizer and a presence. And in all of these capacities, she had performed exactly as expected. She was, by every account of people who knew her before the autumn of 1909, a steady and sensible and fundamentally decent person, a woman who took her responsibilities seriously and who cared genuinely about the people around her. And then she had fallen in love with Bennett Clark Hyde, or had trusted him, or had been convinced by him, or had believed, in the particular way that intelligent women sometimes believe things about men who are telling them very convincing stories, that what he was presenting was what he actually was. The distinction matters, but it is a distinction that only Frances could have fully made, and Frances never spoke publicly about the interior of her marriage in a way that made her private understanding entirely clear. What she left behind was behavior, the sequence of decisions and actions that constitute a life lived under extraordinary pressure. And from that behavior, the patient observer can construct something that approximates the truth of her experience, even if it cannot be the full truth. She had married him in secret in 1905. This tells you something. It tells you that she understood her family would not approve, which means she understood at some level that there were reasons not to approve, which means she had made a conscious decision to proceed despite those reasons. Whether those reasons were simply the social objections of a family that found Hyde insufficiently established, or whether there was something more specific and more troubling that she was already choosing to look past, is impossible to know from the outside. But the secrecy itself speaks to a kind of courage, or a kind of recklessness, or some combination of both, that is worth noting in a woman who was otherwise described as prudent and conventional. Her mother had said, the moment she found out, "He is after the money." Frances had defended him. She had stood between her husband and her mother with the particular fierce loyalty of a woman who has committed herself to someone and intends to honor that commitment regardless of the cost. She had said, in words or in silence, that her mother was wrong, that the family's suspicion was unfair, that Hyde was a good man and a skilled physician, and that the family's resistance to him was rooted in snobbery and in the particular arrogance of wealthy families who believe that anyone seeking to marry into their circle must have an ulterior motive. She had believed this, or she had told herself she believed this, which is sometimes the same thing and sometimes not. And through the years between 1905 and 1909, she had continued to believe it, or to tell herself she did, while the evidence that might have challenged that belief accumulated quietly around her. The grave robbing allegations, the suspension from his position as police surgeon, the prior relationships with wealthy women that preceded his courtship of Frances, the way he spoke about money, not obsessively, not obviously, but with a particular attentiveness that she may have registered and stored in some part of her mind that she did not visit very often. These were the things she had chosen not to fully see. And she had chosen not to see them because seeing them would have required her to undo something that was already done, to admit something that admission would make terrible, to step out of the life she had built and into an uncertainty that she was not ready to face. Then the autumn of 1909 arrived, and the certainty she had been maintaining collapsed, and the uncertainty she had been avoiding became the only reality available. What did Frances know, and when did she know it? This is the question that hovered over the entire case, spoken and unspoken, in newspaper editorials, and in the quiet conversations of the Swope family, and in the minds of the 12 men who sat in the jury box and looked at Frances Hyde sitting in the gallery and tried to read her face. It is the question that history cannot fully answer, because the answer lived entirely inside Frances, and Frances never gave it out completely. What the record shows is this. Frances defended her husband through the investigation and through the first trial. She sat in the courtroom every day. She was present for Pearl Keller's testimony, and for the chemist's testimony, and for the financial testimony that laid out, in precise and damning detail, exactly what her husband had stood to gain from the deaths of 3 members of her family. She sat through all of it with the composed, unreadable expression of a woman who has decided that whatever she knows or suspects, she will not let it show on her face in a room full of reporters and spectators and people who are looking at her with the particular hungry attention of an audience that wants a reaction. She did not break down. She did not cover her face with her hands. She did not weep publicly or rage publicly or perform any of the emotional responses that would have been entirely understandable in a woman sitting through a trial in which her husband was accused of murdering her uncle. She sat. She watched. She listened. And on her face, the careful observers who were watching her noted something that they described in various ways, as dignity, as denial, as the expression of a woman who has gone somewhere inside herself where the noise outside cannot reach. After the verdict, after Hyde was taken away to serve the life sentence that the court had imposed, Frances continued. She continued in the particular sense of simply persisting. of getting up in the morning and doing the things that days require, of managing her household and her relationships, and her position in a social world that was now looking at her with the complicated attention of people who are not entirely sure what to make of her. She was, after all, the wife of a convicted murderer, the niece of one of his victims, the sister of another victim's family member. She occupied a position of such profound contradiction that the ordinary social scripts simply did not apply. There was no established way to be Frances Hyde in 1910. There was no model for how a woman in her position was supposed to conduct herself, no community of similar women whose example she could follow, no advice column or social convention that addressed her specific circumstances. She had to invent it. She had to find, by trial and error and the sheer determination of someone who has no other option, a way to live inside a situation that had no precedent and no map. The retrials helped in one perverse and specific way. They kept the legal situation unresolved, which meant that Frances's position remained technically that of a defendant's wife rather than a convicted killer's wife, and that distinction gave her a small but real measure of social latitude. A wife who stands by her husband through a wrongful conviction, or through what might be a wrongful conviction, in a case where the Supreme Court has found procedural errors, is a sympathetic figure. A wife who stands by a convicted killer after all legal recourse has been exhausted is a different kind of figure entirely. Frances benefited, in a narrow and painful way, from the legal ambiguity that infuriated everyone else involved in the case. But the retrials also prolonged her exposure. They required her to remain in proximity to a situation that she needed to move away from. They kept the story alive in the newspapers at precisely the moments when it might otherwise have begun to fade. They made her name inseparable from a narrative that she had not chosen and could not control, and that was defining her in the public mind in ways that had nothing to do with who she actually was. There were conversations. There were private conversations between Frances and her family, particularly with her mother and her sister Margaret, that were reported in fragments in the accounts of people who were present for some of them. Margaret, who had received a capsule from Hyde's hand and who had survived because her body had expelled it violently, was not inclined toward patience or diplomacy on the subject of her sister's husband. Margaret had nearly died. Margaret had lain on a sickroom floor in convulsions while Hyde stood nearby, and Margaret had made up her mind about what that meant, and she was not the kind of woman who softened her conclusions out of consideration for a family member's emotional comfort. Frances, Margaret said, in one account that was preserved and later reported, "You know what he did." It was not a question. Frances did not answer immediately. The pause that followed that statement, the pause that the person reporting the conversation later described as the longest pause they had ever witnessed between two people who loved each other, was itself an answer of a kind. It was the pause of a woman who has been asked to say out loud the thing she has been carrying in silence, the thing she has been pressing down and covering over and building other things on top of, and who is feeling the weight of it pressing back. "I know," Frances said finally, "that he is my husband." It was the answer of a woman who is choosing loyalty over truth, or who is choosing not to choose, which is its own kind of choosing. It was also, if you listen to it carefully, an answer that does not say what Margaret had asked. Margaret had asked whether Frances knew what Hyde had done. Frances answered with what Hyde was to her, which is a very precise kind of non-answer, the kind that tells you that the person delivering it is living in the space between knowing and not knowing, that they are in the place where the evidence is sufficient but the acknowledgement is not yet possible. There came a point where the acknowledgement became possible, where whatever Frances had been holding in that space broke through the surface and demanded to be named. We do not know exactly when that point arrived. We do not know whether it was a single moment, a conversation, a document, a piece of evidence newly revealed, or whether it was a gradual accumulation, the slow pressure of years of living alongside an unacknowledged truth until the structure maintaining the silence finally gave way. What we know is what she did. She divorced him. The divorce was granted after the retrials had produced their inconclusive results. It was granted quietly, without the public drama that might have been expected given the public nature of everything else connected to the case. Frances's attorneys managed it with a discretion that suggested they understood how much attention it would attract, and were working actively to minimize that attention. The legal proceedings were brief. The settlement was private. And when it was done, Francis Swope Hyde became Francis Swope again, and began the careful, quiet work of reconstructing a life that had been interrupted in 1909 and had not, in any fully meaningful sense, resumed since. She was not a young woman by this point. The years of the investigation and the trials and the retrials had aged her in the way that prolonged stress ages people, not visibly, not dramatically, but deeply, in the interior structures of a person's energy and resilience and capacity for lightness. She was thinner than she had been. She was quieter than she had been. The steadiness that had always characterized her had taken on a different quality. Not the steadiness of someone who has not been tested, but the steadiness of someone who has been tested past what she thought were her limits, and has discovered that her limits were further out than she knew. She moved. She found a new home in a part of the city where the associations were less oppressive, where she could walk to the market and sit in a garden and exist in the ordinary rhythms of daily life, without every corner reminding her of something she was trying to move past. She reconnected with family members who had been estranged during the years when her loyalty to Hyde had placed her in opposition to them. She reconnected with her mother, carefully, in the particular careful way of women who have hurt each other and who understand that the hurt was real and that the healing will take time, and that both things can be true simultaneously. Her mother received her. This matters. Maggie Swope, who had said from the beginning that Hyde was after the money, who had been correct in a way that was as terrible as it was vindicated, who had watched her daughter defend the man responsible for her brother's death. Maggie received Francis back into the warmth of the family without, as far as the record shows, any extended period of recrimination or punishment. She understood what Francis had been through. She understood it as a mother understands the impossible positions her children sometimes find themselves in, with the particular grace of a woman who loves someone enough to meet them where they are rather than where she thinks they should be. Francis and her mother sat together. They drank tea or coffee in the way of women of their era and their class, in a warm room with the ordinary furniture of domestic life around them, and they talked. Not about Hyde, not at first, not directly. They talked about the people they had lost, about the Colonel, about Chrisman, about the particular silence that specific people leave behind them when they are gone, the silence that is shaped like them, and that you keep almost filling with the habit of their presence before the habit catches itself and remembers. They talked about the park, about how much the Colonel had loved Kansas City, about how he had walked those 1,400 acres when they were still raw and undeveloped, when they were the land that nobody else wanted, and had seen in them something that he could give, a gift large enough to outlast him and to mean something to people who would never know his name. Francis had